Hello and good morning, evening or afternoon, depending on when you are turning into this latest SustyTalk interview from Edie. I'm sure you know the drill by now, but for those that don't, SustyTalks are our ongoing series of video interviews with sustainability leaders, activists and NGOs, first launched during the first lockdown here in the UK in early 2020 and continuing more than 2 years on to help us keep informed, inspired and connected. And this latest interview comes to you at a crucial time for us, Edie. We have just launched Net Zero November, a month of online content dedicated to helping businesses combat the climate crisis and reach net zero emissions in a just and equitable manner. And of course, November also marks COP27. And throughout the month, we'll be providing insights, updates, and reflections on the 2-week global summit in Egypt. And that's where today's SustyTalk guest comes in. So I'm Edie's content editor, Matt Mace, and joining me today is Molly Fannon, who is the CEO of UN Live, which I believe is described as a global museum aiming to empower people everywhere to take positive global action. So Molly, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
And so firstly, perhaps it'd be great to get a bit about your background and your role at UN
Sure.
Live and how that, I suppose, chimes with our audience of sustainability professionals.
Yeah. So I am the CEO of the Museum for, not about the United Nations, and that's a really critical and important distinction that we can come back to. Importantly, though, I think about me as a person is that I'm not a museum person by background. So I began my career in development, primarily in human rights, small and medium enterprise development, biodiversity conservation, mostly in Latin America, later in Eastern and Southern Africa and the Middle East. But I always had an academic hunch and then later an academic thread on the role that culture, frankly, has always played in major reckonings of who we aspire to be in the future, whether you are newly free or newly decolonized countries in Latin America in the 1800s, or whether you're societies today, right, that are facing this crisis. I did a Fulbright on it. I worked on it in many other countries, and eventually ended up at the Smithsonian Institution, which is the world's largest complex of museums and scientific research centers, where I led global engagement and global strategy, and headed up all of our biodiversity and climate change work together with hundreds of scientists at that institution. And then I heard, while I was at the Smithsonian, I heard about this new organization called UN Live, the Museum for, not about, the United Nations. We might actually change our title to always include the not about. And I was tempted to throw my name in the hat as CEO. And I remember telling my family, like, don't worry, that'll never happen. We'll never move to Europe. We were in the States at the time. And it has happened. I think what's important about that is that we are not a traditional museum, which was why I was drawn to it. Where I've worked with, dozens of museums around the world, primarily in the global South, and museums do have a very important role to play. However, they're not a panacea necessarily, and that would come as no shock, but they do, museums and the cultural sector, and I can get to this why and the science behind it, why it should matter for sustainability leaders, particularly in the business sector, to care about the role of culture. I would love to talk to you about that, why that matters. I came to UN Live to become the head of an organization that is branded with the United Nations, but wholly independent of the United Nations. And that's really important. We're there to hold not just corporations to account, but the United Nations itself to account. The first 3 words of the UN founding charter are "We the Peoples." And when UN Live was founded by Ban Ki-moon and the other, at the time, living Secretary Generals, Kofi Annan and others, they all admitted that the UN was really no longer holding to that "we the peoples." It has become we the multinational organizations, we the nation states, we the corporations. And our role isn't actually to empower people. People are already powerful. It's to help people recognize their agency, whether it's in their consumer agency, whether it's in their ability to drive social norms and behavior change in their communities, et cetera, their agency already to make a difference. Because without individual actions, we will not see the change that we need to see on a systemic level, especially not with climate. That was a little all over the place, but yeah.
No, that's great. You mentioned a few kind of key words there that kind of are perhaps slightly different in terms of the corporate world. You mentioned obviously culture as a big one, and an agency as well. And for our audience, I think a lot of businesses are trying to find what their agency looks like through the lens of purpose. Business purpose is kind of big buzzword at the moment, and it's a reflection of how their business performs in a society, performs in a culture through the lens of the climate crisis. So you mentioned you'd like to touch a bit more on why culture is important, and culture and purpose are kind of big enigmatic themes that are quite hard to define, and in a real kind of science of the debate around the climate crisis, how do you see culture playing a part?
I think actually, unless culture begins to play a much stronger part, we're not going to solve the climate crisis. And I'm not alone in that thinking. So two examples of others who have come to similar conclusions. One is a partner that we're maturing our relationship with, which is MIT's JPAL. JPAL is the gold standard for looking at social impact on all sorts of international development programs, including climate change social impact programs. They themselves, through their work, are pointing to the power of culture. So, for example, in Latin America, if you want to change policy in, let's say, the education sector, the best place, as identified by MIT's JPAL, to invest your money and develop a return on investment in terms of policy change is the telenovela sector. It's the soap opera industry in Latin America. That's echoed then by other behavioral change scientists like Mahzarin Banaji, who's a professor of social ethics and psychology at Harvard University, who wrote an amazing book called Blind Spot. Blind Spot is about those biases that we all hold as human beings that we are not even aware of until we're put into a functional MRI machine. Her studies with millions of participants in the US on the 14 major biases that her book encompasses, including race, gender, sexuality, etc., show that there are trends of changing community-wide implicit bias. There are trends, but most of them are quite slow, where the prediction that the bias might switch from being a negative one to a positive one, with one exception, which is sexual orientation and sexual identity, sexuality. In that case, in sexuality, Mahzarin Banaji's team has identified that in 26 years, socially across the United States, the bias around people who don't tend to a hetero way of thinking of themselves will disappear from the United States culture. And she herself has said that it's actually the power of mass culture and the fact that mass culture jumped in, whether through Ellen DeGeneres or Will and Grace or others, that changed people's perceptions of what's socially acceptable. And when she gave this brilliant lecture I attended, it was not about climate change, but she left the stage. She came back on the stage at Harvard and she said, I've been thinking about climate change. Until we start to employ mass culture the same way mass culture jumped in on this issue, we will not address this. So when you think about climate change, whether it's the agency that corporations and their consumers need to take, whether it's buying a certain product or voting in a certain way or investing your money in a certain way, we need to be able to change social norms about what's acceptable and what's demanded of individuals. What science is proving increasingly is that mass culture is the fastest way to do so. And therefore, UN Live is employing mass culture deliberately in key geographies around the world to get to people where they are at scale, because we don't have a lot of time to play with right now, in order to drive the agency of billions of people and drive the systems change and tip the business leaders and the political leaders to make the decisions that they need to make faster and more effectively.
And this mass culture aspect is really interesting, because if I cast my mind back 12 months, it did feel like net zero and certainly COP26 and the fact it was in Glasgow obviously helped, did kind of dominate kind of everything. Businesses were getting involved. Yeah. It was constantly referenced on the news. It was a mainstream aspect. You couldn't turn on the radio or turn on the TV without hearing about COP26, which was great. And 12 months on, we're in COP27. It's been hosted in Egypt, obviously, and I should clarify to our audience, you'll probably listen to this whilst COP27 is going on. This is recorded a week before. But it feels slightly different, less kind of perhaps grand scale. And I know because it's just a continuation of what was agreed in Glasgow. But the importance of COP27 is one, making sure nations kind of ratchet up their ambitions, submit new NDCs, submit new targets, but also to hear the voice of the global south, the people that are very much on the front line of the climate crisis and having to deal with those problems, to day. And how do you think preparations have gone in terms of giving a platform to those people to perhaps kind of create that kind of mass culture around the global south, and how what they're dealing with can be amplified across the world?
Yeah. So I'm not going to speak on behalf of the COP27 organizers or the delegations that are involved in that. I'll speak from my own perspective as an individual who's worked primarily in the global south, and who really looks to the global south as a point of inspiration. So UN Live is deliberately working primarily in the global south right now, though not exclusively, and that's really important because we need to have still south-north discussions that are really focused on telling a counter narrative about where power lies. But the reason we're focused primarily on the global south is because the global south is not a place just on the front lines of the climate crisis. It's not a place where you just see people who have outsized effects of the climate crisis that they have not contributed directly to. The global south is also a place, and I'm using very broad brush strokes, so understand that I understand that there are very different realities in all of the different places that fit within the global south, right? The global south is full of communities who, through their resilience through crisis, right, have become models of what we need to be learning from in the global north. So if you do not have decision fora that include the voices, not just of the unheard people, but of people in the frontline crisis areas that have been encountering, whether it's refugee crises that have been driven because of climate issues, or whether it's flooding in Mozambique, or whether it's flooding in Pakistan or other places, then actually we're missing out on the ingenuity and the resilience of people who are on the front lines, not simply looking to them as beneficiaries of aid or people who need something from the global north. That is a key element that has driven me throughout my entire career, and that will drive UN Live as well, is telling a counter narrative about where ingenuity and where power lies. And so what UN Live has done with the support of the IKEA Foundation during COP26, when you're right, when COP26 kind of was everywhere, and even people who, and let's be frank, which is the majority of the human race, who do not know about what COP is, right? They think it's a police officer. They don't think it's a climate negotiating meeting that happens on an annual basis. So it's rare to have a COP that's so prominent in media and in mass media. We need to be speaking to people who do not think of COP, who do not read the IPCC reports, who do not know what the IPBES report is on biodiversity. We need to be talking to people who do not watch nature documentaries on Netflix. We need to be talking to the movable middle, as one of our partner organizations with Global Optimism, as Christiana Figueres talks about them, the movable middle, because those are the people that are going to hold the politicians and the corporate leaders to account. It's those swing voters on the issue who are not already climate activists, and they're certainly not climate deniers, that everybody needs to be paying attention to. So our program that's supported with the IKEA Foundation, when I was in dialogue at COP26 with the IKEA Foundation last year, they said to me, wouldn't it be great if we could get the voices of the many to COP next year? And I said, yeah, wouldn't it be great? And later, if you want to, I can talk about an experiment, and I think a bit of a learning and a failure that we had at COP26 last year. But what I said to them was, wouldn't it be even better if we got them to their voices to COP27 in conversation with one another? So what we've done as a museum for the United Nations cannot be in one place alone. We've created these conversation portals that we're embedding within local host institutions who know their constituencies and their local communities the best, to take the most important element of what a cultural organization can do, which is inspire people to join in conversation that is rooted in curiosity and not in fear, right? So the societies that we all are seeing, whether in Europe, certainly in the United States, even in Brazil, of increased polarization, where we really need to start bringing people together across difference. That's really critical. That's a key element of what we're doing. But we're planting these conversation portals all over the world, predominantly in the global south, to not just connect to COP27, but perhaps even more importantly, to connect to one another and to COP27 to bring voices of the many, whether from Bangladesh, from Mali, from South Africa, from Rwanda, Uganda, Mexico, the United States as well, to COP27 and bring COP27 out to those local communities. So this is about weaving conversations together, developing a methodology, making sure voices that can't be at COP are heard, making sure formal leaders are held to account, and inviting formal leaders into conversations with other leaders in other parts of the world who might happen to be in a refugee camp, right, in Bangladesh, or in a refugee camp in Erbil, but are no less powerful in their everyday lives, which is a key component of this.
No, it's a great kind of mission to have, and I think that's incredibly important to get that kind of that diversity even of voices. And there's a phrase you mentioned that I really want to pick up on. You mentioned it was kind of capturing curiosity and not fear.
Yeah.
And because you mentioned not everyone knows what COP is, not everyone has read the IPCC reports. For those that have, though, it's quite easy to be fearful. It's quite easy to be demoralized. And I know people like Cristiano Figueres and Tom Carnot have adopted phrases like stubborn optimism and whatnot. And I very much align to that. But it's also easy for that to kind of wear off after a while and to fall back onto the severity of the issue we're facing, that a planet, even if we reach 1.5 degrees, is going to be vastly different today. How do you recommend that sustainability professionals, climate activists who are on the front line every day take that lens of curiosity over fear? Because it can be quite easy just to get kind of stuck in your tracks just because of the fear aspect around the climate crisis.
Yeah. I mean, we're all human beings, right? So I was on a panel a few years ago with a climate mental health researcher who said basically, if you're suffering from climate anxiety, that's a sign that you're mentally healthy. So I think those of us, and I include myself in the us, that read the articles, that read the reports, and that do get scared as hell, as we're going to, I have the terrible habit of reading the newspaper as I drift off to sleep every night. And so reading all of the latest articles on climate, my job is to remain optimistic and is to pull people in to conversation, because I think that is the recipe for what will actually engender action. But I too find myself frozen in apathy at times. And it's those moments when sometimes I just need to close down the bad news, get a good night's sleep, and wake up refreshed, because the reality is that the science not only is saying that culture is not fluffy, culture actually might be an unprecedented and completely unparalleled tool of communication and of rallying people to push decision makers in the right direction. But and science is saying that and is proving that increasingly. What science is also saying is that fear does not motivate people to take positive action. Fear keeps you in a frozen state of inaction. And the one thing that we have to do, that we're all, I think, jointly responsible for, and I include you and me in this mix, is to say, I am afraid, and therefore I'm going to stay hopeful. Hopeful is not like a wishy-washy thing. It means things are hard. I would use another expletive term. Things are really hard right now. And because they're so hard, I'm going to work even harder to make a future that I cannot yet envision materialize for people who I will never meet again. Staying in a place of fear is in many ways a privileged position for people who are not thinking about generations that will follow, or people who are in relatively safe locations right now and are not already suffering the devastating effects of climate change that we already see. So I do think that we're all human beings, and if you're not afraid, you're not paying close enough attention. So I agree with you on that. And yet the science says that if we stay in a place of fear and we don't remain optimistic and we don't remain hopeful in the grittiest and most hardworking sense of that word, then we're not holding ourselves to essentially the moral accountability I think we all have right now collectively.
You made the kind of hopefulness around it sound like a real kind of selfless attribute, which is a great thing to take on board. And through the lens of being hopeful, then with COP27 happening now, what would a kind of, what are you hopeful about COP27? What would success look like for you from the 2-week summit?
I think from my perspective, what's most important is that individuals around the world, I don't think it's important necessarily that individuals around the world even know that COP27 is a thing or that COP28 is already being planned, right? There is a machinery that's happening from the political perspective that will run, but the everyday actions that people all around the world can take that will drive the political demand for the change in all of the subsequent COPs are critical. And so my hope for COP27, for the program that I'm responsible for, together with the IKEA Foundation in partnership, is that we let formal decision makers or leaders know that they are not in this alone, and that without listening, particularly to people who are not there, they cannot make the change. I told you I was going to reference a failure that we had. I have the great privilege of working with Olafur Eliasson as one of my co-founders. He's a contemporary artist. If you've not heard of him, for the Paris COP, he developed the ice watch, the icebergs that were outside Paris. And last year, with his artwork, we projected one of his pieces of artwork called Earth Speaker onto COP26's armadillo, so the decision-making, the blue zone, essentially, right? And that piece of artwork was all children demanding change and using their voices and their faces to demand change. And yet, at the same time, we were unwittingly being a failure of keeping kids on the outside of the decision fora. When that artwork had been tested in the EU Parliament months prior, and people could hear those kids' voices in 60 languages around the world, and they walked in and out of the EU Parliament building, and we talked to people who worked in that building, both politicians and professionals alike, after this pilot. They said things like, "I can't sleep at night. I am thinking of my job entirely differently." So this year's program with UN Live is to get us into the blue zone. It's to make sure that people's everyday voices, not just children, yes, including children, but everyday voices of people, especially climate activists, because we're targeting activists who have not yet had a chance to make it to COP27, as well as people from all different sectors, that their voices are unmissable. And so we're doing that. You will be able to enter into a conversation both from the blue zone to all of these different locations around the world, primarily in the global south. But we're also making sure, through our relationship with another organization at MIT out of the Media Lab called the Center for Constructive Communication, to do machine listening of all of the conversations and to project the key threads and the key quotes up both online and physically at COP, so that the core of the conversations, whether directly with COP or between other locations, are in your face, so that people who are at COP in the blue zone, negotiators and decision makers alike from all different sectors, political, corporate, nonprofit, also say, "I can't sleep at night. I think of my job in an entirely different way." That's the standard that we're trying to hold ourselves to. Importantly, too, I think what we're setting up now is not a campaign. It's not some fluffy piece of artwork that we're doing for the sake of COP. It's actually the first trial run of an infrastructure we plan to keep standing and growing over the next at least 10-year period, to develop an archive of the conversation right now, of the time, of this critical moment in humanity, so that we can not just analyze the conversation, but more importantly, use the conversation to drive change and affect change, beginning first with climate, but eventually going to any of the big thorny issues that we need to address right now.
That sounds amazing. I'll be sure to look out for that as well. And you again, another phrase I wanted to just jump on for my final question about making those voices, the everyday people, unmissable. A lot of our audience will be sustainability professionals working for businesses. A lot of those businesses will be multinational, with supply chains that span multiple continents, and a lot of them will have kind of net zero targets or aspirations in place, and they've kind of just they've set them, they've got it signed off that we're going to reach net zero by 2050, 2040, 2030. They have a plan to get there. What advice would you have to them to get those views of those kind of people, of the workers on the ground, in kind of, hard to reach places, as we're kind of calling it, and make sure that their views, their thoughts are unmissable? What kind of mechanisms can businesses turn to make sure that they are taking those voices into account?
Well, I think it would come as no surprise to any business leaders that you're working with or that are reading and tuning into your journalism, that if they don't connect to Generation Z, which will be their primary consumer base for the next 40 years, they will go out of business. Generation Z is primarily driven by the ethics of the organizations. They are way more likely to engage with corporations that take their voices and their issues seriously. And importantly, I think the stats from just a few years ago, so I might not be completely right on this right now, but it was something like 69% of Generation Z consumers will drop a business if they do not hold themselves to the promises that they're making. So if you're making net zero promises and you don't have a plan for how you're going to reach net zero, and you're not communicating with your consumer base, with your worker base around that, then you're putting your business at risk, right? Because consumer acquisition is a lot more expensive than consumer retention. So I think that there are ways that that corporations can engage and must engage with their customer base, both to do the right thing, right? Because we're all human beings at the end of the day, whether you're a CEO of a multinational corporation or someone on the front lines in the global south, right? We're all equally human beings who are going to be dealing with climate change. So we all have a responsibility, both selfishly as well as looking outwardly to address this. But also, if you're just thinking about the long-term sustainability of your business from a corporate point of view, you have to be in listening mode. You have to not just be in listening mode, but in engagement mode of asking consumers and workforce to lend their action and their energy towards your shared mission. That's what's proving. That's why Patagonia is doing so well right now, because Patagonia went from, an outerwear company to a company that's promoting action in local communities. You can go to their website and type where you're located and find organizations where you can take action. They're doing that because they're a good company, but they're also doing that because they know it's the way to retain corporations. When you engage in conversation and listening with your audiences, you get better informed and you generate stronger links and ties. We believe at UN Live that it's through this listening and conversation that any and all change will actually happen. And somebody needs to be sure that we're developing ways of having, and to get back to that notion that you brought up earlier of curiosity rather than fear. Right now, there are not many safe spaces for public discourse in the world where people are able to have conversation in a way that doesn't fracture or pull or make everything about conflict, right? And so what we're working to develop is not a squishy feel-good methodology, but is a methodology for how we can approach difference, which can be very difficult, with respect and curiosity in order to build bridges rather than dig trenches between people. That we need it sounds a bit fluffy, but until we have a greater sense of empathy in this world for people who live in far-flung places from where we are, or generations that we will never meet, until we can be empathetic for people who live in space-time continuum far away from us or geographically far away from us, until we can feel and put ourselves in those shoes, we will not generate the demand for climate action that we need to, both from corporate and political leaders. And so this program is as much about bringing in unheard voices as it is about the long, hard work of developing a renewed sense of empathy and a renewed sense of connection, which is why we call this program the Global We, that we all belong to this. Whether you are a CEO of a multinational corporation who's engaging in one of these conversations, or a young climate activist in a small community somewhere.
Brilliant, Molly. It's been a pleasure listening and conversing with you about listening and conversing. So thank you so much for that. It's I'm sure that's going to prove a real kind of a well of information and inspiration and curiosity rather than fear for our audience, which is Great, but we are out of time. I don't want to keep you any longer. So it's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Likewise. Thank you, Matt. Have a great day.
Thank you. And we will continue to keep you, our audience, up to date with the latest developments at COP27, and we'll bring you further exclusive content for Net Zero November. Be sure to check out edie.net for further information on our Net Zero Action Sessions as well, which is a live online event taking place at the end of this month, which will tap into many of the things we've been able to talk to with Molly about today. And for everybody at home, stay safe, stay positive, and keep up the Susty Talk.
Thanks.